for this morning's shir to thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Baruch Meir and Rena Dubin, for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in the zechus of refuah shlema for their niece Chava Tzipporah bas Chaya Malka. May she, together with Kol Cholei Yisroel, have a complete and enduring refuah. And with that, let us begin. Beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Tzadik Chas 98. We are picking up Emirat Hashem on 97b, Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis. Let's pick up with, we got a little bit further down. Let's pick up with Tanan, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. We actually got a little bit further in than that, but let's pick up from here again. So remember again, the Mishnah introduced us in yesterday's daf to a fascinating concept about the idea of a woman who has converted with her sons, right? And then ultimately, again, the sons get married. One of the sons dies without children. So halacha l'maisa, again, the Mishnah said, in cholzin ve'en miyabmin. Lo cholzin, right? There's no chalitza, there's no yibum. So the Gemara introduced an interesting case. So then the Gemara spoke about Bnei Yudan. You had this maidservant, this Amsa, the slave woman, Yudan, who was emancipated. Obviously, upon emancipation, she, together with her children, became Jewish. And we had an interesting machlokes, Rav Achar bar Yaakov and Rav Sheshes. Rav Achar bar Yaakov allowed the sons to marry each other's wives. Again, not in other words, namely, if there were two brothers and one of the brothers divorced his wife or one of the brothers died, but he had children, so Rav Achar bar Yaakov allowed the remaining brother to marry the widow or to marry the divorcee. And Rav Sheshes said it was asur. Now, obviously, what's at the root of the machlokes over here? That Rav Achar bar Yaakov felt that halacha l'maisa, because they were converts, gershin eskayer kikatan shenola dami. The brothers aren't really related, so because halachically they're not related. So because they're not related, therefore halacha l'maisa, there's no problem with them going ahead and marrying each other's spouses. Rav Sheshes, on the other hand, seems to feel, which is we think the sentiment echoed in our Mishnah, that there is a maternal relationship that exists there. Because we know definitively that they come from the same mother, there is a relationship that exists, and therefore it appears that Chazal were concerned in this type of situation to allow brothers to marry each other's spouses. Why? Lest you come to confuse this with a general case, a regular case, we'll call it, of regular Jewish brothers who are prohibited to marry each other's spouses. So that's the tension that's happening over here. So this says the Gemara Tanan, Hagiorish neskare bana ima. So again, the Gemara is quoting a Mishnah, a Giores that converted her sons along with her. Lo choltza v'lo miyabmin. They're not permitted to chalitza or yibum. My taima, what's the reason? La mishum da asiri. So we'll say again, what's the reason? The reason is because halacha l'maisa, what we call she'er min ha'em, when brothers are related from their mother, maternal brothers, there is a gzera d'Rabbanan that they cannot marry each other's wives. So the Gemara says, "Lo, de'ina b'taros chalitza v'yibum." V'shayla amat, which the Gemara says, "No." We'll say this is what we did yesterday. No, the reason you can't do it, we'll say the Gemara, all the Mishnah is actually teaching you is that these brothers are not subject to yibum. In other words, what the Mishnah is just saying is that halacha l'maisa, there's no mitzvah of yibum. Ultimately, again, and therefore these women, when they are widowed, even if their husbands died without children, they are permitted to marry who? Anyone they want. And not only that, ve'inhu nami sharu. They're even permitted to marry the brothers. That's what the Mishnah is teaching me. I v'hakatani afilu. But I will say in the Mishnah's case, it said afilu. Remember again, the Mishnah then went on to say, afilu horasa sharishon shelo bikdusha, v'leidaso bikdusha. Even if the first brother was conceived before the mother converted, but he was born once the mother was Jewish, and the second brother was conceived and born once the mother was Jewish, still, there is no yibum and chalitza. Se'i amrit bishlama asiri. If you say that the wives are prohibited to marry their brothers-in-law, so bishlama, se'i amrit bishlama asiri, hainu diktani afilu. The avagav, the rishon, horoso shelo bikdusha, v'leidaso bikdusha, v'asheni horasa v'leidaso bikdusha, ukeshtei imos damu, afilu hahi asiri. So I will say, if you understand that the Mishnah is coming to prohibit the wives, or I should say, the wives of the brothers from marrying the brother-in-laws, then halacha l'maaseh makes sense that the Mishnah employs the lashon of afilu, because in the second case of the Mishnah, it's almost as if the two brothers are coming from two different mothers, because the mother was in a different state with the conception of each of her sons. Nevertheless, it's still usher for the brothers-in-law, for the brothers to marry the other brother's wife. Eli'i amrit sharu mayafilu. But if lamaisa, again, they're permitted to marry the wives, then ultimately what's afilu? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Even though this is a case where when both brothers are born, their mother is already Jewish, and you could confuse this with the case of a regular Jewish woman, afilu haki. Nevertheless, it's going to be permitted. So I will say, therefore, again, it's not clear that you could infer from the reading of the Mishnah one way or the other. Ika da'amri, an alternate version of this. Hachinami mistabra desharu. The truth is, the simple reading of the Mishnah would seem to indicate that what? That in this case, Rabbi say, of maternal brothers. Now again, Rabbi say, when we speak about, just to be clear, in a case of regular maternal brothers, so there is absolutely no problem with halacha l'maaseh, one brother marrying the other brother's widow or divorce. I'm sorry, I take that back. Strike that from the record, right? So I will say, remember again, we're dealing over here with a very specific case of a woman who converts two sons. It could be more than two sons, but for our purposes, two sons. In this case, there's no father in the picture. Why? It could be that they have a father. Obviously, they have a father. But lamaisa, again, from a conversion perspective, that father is not in the picture. So what's the tension over here is, how do we look at these brothers regarding the prohibition to marry a brother's wife? So remember again, the Mishnah is telling me there's no yibum and chalitza. What we're trying to figure out is, what does that mean there's no yibum and chalitza? That there's no mitzvah of yibum and chalitza because they're maternal brothers, and they're therefore permitted to marry each other's wives? Or that no, halacha l'maaseh, there's no yibum and chalitza because technically speaking there's no mitzvah, but they are precluded midrabanan from marrying each other's spouses, lest you come to confuse this with a regular case of a Jewish mother and her offspring. So this is the Ikid Amri, Hachanai Mistabra, the Sharu. It would appear based on the Mishnah that they are permitted to marry each other's widows, or divorcees for that matter. Diktani afilu. As well, because the second case the Mishnah is introduced with afilu. Sharu, hainu diktani afilu. See, if you hold that halacha l'maaseh is permitted, that's why it's introduced with afilu. The afagav the tarvayu leidasam bekedusha. The asilich lufe Yisroel. Because even though they're both born, once their mother is Jewish, and you could confuse this with the case of a regular Jewish family, afilu hachisharu. Nevertheless, they are permitted. Eli'i amrit asiri. But if you say that they are prohibited, so mayafilu, then why does the Mishnah introduce the second case with afilu? I'll tell you why. The afagav the rishon haraso shelo biktusha, v'leidasa biktusha, because son number one is conceived before his mother is Jewish. He's born once his mother is Jewish. V'asheni harasa v'leidasa biktusha. Son number two is conceived and born to a Jewish mother. The kishtei imaos dami. This almost looks like a case of two mothers, but yet afilu hachi asui. Nevertheless, ultimately, again, they are prohibited to marry each other's wives. Okay, so therefore I will say, it's not clear from the Mishnah, would we paskin ultimately again, like Rav Acha bar Yaakov, or like Rav Sheshes? So Tashma, let's analyze a bit more. Shnei achin te'umim. But say interesting case. Shnei achin te'umim gerim. You have two brothers, twins, who are converts. V'chei meshuchrarin. And similarly again, two slave brothers who are emancipated. What's the halacha? Lo chotzim v'lo miyabin. They don't do chalitza, they don't do yibam. Ve'in chayavim mishum eshes ach. And interestingly enough, also, there is no prohibition of eshes ach. Now, I both say, this price is a bit more explicit. So watch what's happening over here. Look what the price just said. Two brothers, twins. So I will say, here's what's fascinating. So now, again, they convert. They convert. So the Mishnah now tells me that halacha l'maisa, there's no yibum, there's no chalitza, but there's also no prohibition of brother's wife. So let's say the two converted brothers, Reuven and Shimon, and now what happens? Reuven dies, Shimon is permitted to marry the widow, or Reuven divorces his wife, Shimon is permitted to go ahead and marry Reuven's divorcee. Ein chayil mishum eishes ach, haisa horasan shelo b'kedusha, v'lei dasan b'kedusha. Now, Rabosai, case number one is a case of brothers who, let's say, convert when they're adults. So they're converting on their own. Okay, that's case one. Case two, haisa horasan shelo b'kedusha, v'lei dasan b'kedusha. If halacha l'maisa, they were conceived, their mother became pregnant with them while she was a Gentile. And then what happens? She goes ahead and she converts. So by the time they're born, they are born to a Jewish mother. Then, lo chotzim v'lo miyabmin, halacha l'maisa, there's still no yibum and chalitza. Aval chayavin mishum eshes ach. Interesting. But I will say in this case, halacha l'maisa, they are chayiv for eshes ach. In other words, they would not be permitted to marry each other's widows or divorcees. So the Gemara says, then I will say, what if their conception and their birth was with their mother already Jewish? Well, in that case, but I will say, if you're conceived by a Jewish mother and born to a Jewish mother, then guess what? You're just a regular Jew. So I will say, what's the point that's important for us over here? Katani mihas ein chayavin mishum eshes ach. So I will say, what's interesting to us is the first case, right? In case number one, where you have Reuven and Shimon converting on their own, two brothers converting on their own. So I will say, in that case, interestingly enough, the Mishnah told me, the Brisa told me, no yibum, no chalitza, but halacha l'maisa, there's no isser of eshes ach. So the Gemara says, chiyuv aleka, that teaches me ultimately there's no chiyuv. In other words, there's no liability. However, top of tzadik ches, ha-isura ika. But the truth is, again, there would still be an isser. Then I will say, what's the isser? Rashi says over here, midrabanan. B'pashtas, there'd still be an isser dirabanan. Why? Rashi says over here, lo leisi lach lufe bi Yisroel. Ultimately, again, I will say, because remember, what are we concerned about? Why would there be an Isser D'Rabbanan? I will say, listen to this case. Reuven and Shimon are adult men. They go ahead and they convert. So I will say, what's the nature of their relationship to one another if they convert? What's the nature of their relationship? None. Halachically, none. Should there be any type of problem with them marrying each other's divorcees or anything else? And the answer is no, because they're considered to be halachically totally unrelated. Yet Rabbi said the Gemara infers from here that there is still an Isser D'Rabbanan. Why would there be an Isser D'Rabbanan? Because Rabbi said, what are we concerned about? We're concerned about that people don't always know details. And if they see two brothers, right? Reuven gets divorced, and now Shimon marries Reuven's divorcee. People see that. They don't know who converts, who didn't convert. So there's a concern that people will get confused with the halacha. So therefore, again, it could be that there's an Isser D'Rabbanan for brothers in general to go ahead and marry each other's spouses. To which the Gemara says, the truth is, it could be that there's not even an Isser D'Rabbanan. And really, it's only coming to include, only reason it said chayiv is because of Mishnaic symmetry. Since in the Seif we had to write Chayiv, Tanyinami Reisha Ein Chayavin. Reisha also wrote Ein Chayavin, but maybe it's not just Ein Chayavin, there's no culpability. Maybe there's no Isser D'Rabbanan as well. So Amar Rava. So Rava said, Hada Amar Rabbanan Ein Avla Mitzri. When the Rabbanan say that there is no paternity for a Mitzri, which Rava say ultimately means that halacha l'maisa, that a guy, a Gentile, does not have established paternity. Look at Rashi. Had Amar Rabbanan ein avla Mitzri, v'afilu heichad deleka lemeimar ki katan shenola dami, ki gon harasa shelo b'kedusha, v'leidasa b'kedusha, diyesh lo she'er min ha'em ki shar Yisroel gamar, ein lo she'er min ha'av. So I will say, remember, this is actually very interesting. In general, if you've seen in halacha, even though we say that when a person converts, When a person converts, they're like a child that's been reborn, and to a certain degree, any prior relationships cease to exist. But yet what we've established is your relationship with your mother does not really cease to exist. That remains, but with one's father, it's severed. Halachically, it's severed. So what's the pshat? To which the Gemara says, Lo tema mishum dishtufe bezimo to lo yadi. Say, often we assume it's because maybe in the Gentile world, because unfortunately there was so much immorality, maybe again we don't know true paternity. Aval yediya, but I will say, but maybe in a case where we would know paternity in a definitive fashion, we would be choshesh. Ultimately, I will say, it's not true. Even in a case where we would know definitive paternity, we still do not go ahead and establish halachic paternity for a Gentile or for someone who has converted. Why? Because I will say, interesting of the Gemara, the case of twins. I will say, interesting how the Gemara understands that the case of twins, right? The Gemara understands what happened biologically with twins. It's one piece of zera, one piece of sperm that's split into two pieces. That's I guess reflective, right? Reflective ultimately, again, the Gemara understanding that dynamic. So the Gemara said, the tipa achas haisa, the nechla kalashtayim, the katani seifa lo cholsim lo miyabmin. Ultimately, again, Rabbi say, even though again, the Gemara seems to feel that a case of twins would make the argument for a heightened sense of paternal connection. Nevertheless, we still say that those brothers are not paternal brothers. Therefore, lo cholsim lo miyabmin. Therefore, even if they were to convert, there's no chalisa, there's no yibum. Shmamina afkure rachmana lizarei. I will say, just in general, there is an understanding that when it comes to either Gentiles or, again, people who convert, even if we establish a maternal connection, there is no paternal connection. Techsiv, because the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Yecheskel, Basar chamorim bisaram, v'zirmas susim ziramtam. So literally, again, the flesh of donkeys is their flesh. V'zirmas susim ziramtam, and their seed of horses is like their seeds. Rashi says over here, zarmas zera shuyore kechet ki zara ma'im akalim b'koch. So most of the idea is just in general, the way that halacha looks at paternity of a Gentile is we just don't see it as existing. That's the idea in halacha. We just don't see it as existing. So therefore, again, I will say, what's interesting to note over here is, that's why in all of these cases of conversion, halacha l'maisa, we do not look at paternity as a factor. We look at maternity as a factor, because obviously your mother is your mother is your mother. That is a biologically uncontestable fact, that halacha l'maisa, one is connected to their mother. So therefore, I will say, the Gemara is just pointing out over here that even in a case where you have ironclad proof that the father of this Gentile or convert is his father, halachically we don't look at it. So I will say, we're still stuck in our core question, which is, I will say, what do we do in cases of conversion, or for that matter, emancipation? What do we do with brothers? That's really our core question. What do we do with brothers in this case? So I will say, whether it's a case like the Mishnah, where the mother converted and gave birth to her sons after conversion, or again, cases where the sons themselves convert, or again, emancipation. What do you do in these cases with brothers? Do we go ahead and just simply say, Gershin is kayer kekantan shenola dami? When a person converts, it's as if they're born, and therefore no relationships, and therefore again, even though they are biological maternal brothers, they can marry each other's wives? Or do we say no, that whenever we have a situation of brothers, we have to restrict marrying each other's spouses? Why? Out of a concern of creating confusion. That's what's driving us over here. That's the machlokes Rav Sheshes and Rav Acha bar Yaakov. So let's go weiter. So we still haven't resolved it. So Tashma, Don Rabbi Yossi, Maisa b'niftayim hager. There was a story with this guy, Niftayim. That was his name. Niftayim hager. Niftayim the convert. Shenasa eishes achiv me'imo. He married his paternal brother's spouse. Okay, so let's say again, his maternal brother, his maternal brother's spouse. So right, Niftayim converted with his brother, right? Well, we'll see what the case is, but the point over here is his brother, it doesn't matter, his brother died with children, brother got divorced, whatever it is, and Niftayim married his brother's spouse. Uba Maisa Fnei Chachamim, Va'amru Ein Ishus Lager. And the Maisa came before the Chachamim, and the Chachamim said, there is no ishos, there is no marriage for a ger, which we don't understand what that statement means either. So the Gemara says, I understand, there's no marriage for a ger. Ger de kadosh hachanami lo tafsi ba kiddushin. So they tell me that if a ger marries a woman, there's no kiddushin? What does that mean? There's no kiddushin for a ger. Ella ema ein iser ishes ach ger. Rather, what does it mean? It means that the Chazal were saying there is no problem with ishes ach for a ger. So if you have brothers who converted, there's no problem with one brother marrying the other brother's divorcee or widow. Okay, so the Gemara says, well, what's the case? My love din naspa ach kishuhu ger. So I will say, what's the case? So Niftayim convert. Here's what we assume the case is. Niftayim and his brother both converted, right? Brother got married, didn't work out, right? But brother got married after he converted, didn't work out, got divorced, and now Niftayim married the divorcee. So my love dinaspa ach kishu ger, lo dinaspa kishu ovid kochavim. No. What's the case? Where Niftayim's brother married this woman when before he converted, right? When Niftayim's brother was a guy, he married this woman. To which the Gemara says, kishu ovid kochavim, my lememra. We'll say that's of course. Remember again, our whole question is only when maternal brothers convert and get married when they're Jewish. But if Niftayim's brother married his wife, right? If brother got married when brother was a guy, so and what? Then they got divorced and then she converted. So of course Niftayim is allowed to marry that woman. We should be concerned about a marriage that happened when they were Gentiles, lest you come to confuse that with the case of a ger. To which the Gemara says, Kamashma no, Tashma, Damar ben Yasin. So we'll say, so again, so that case is not really a raya, because that must have been a case where Niftayim's brother got married ultimately again before he converted. Rashi points out over here, after they converted, they never lived together. So there was never really a halachic marriage between brother and his wife. So that's a case where Niftayim married his brother's divorcee or widow. That's an obvious case. So Tashman Daran ben Yasin said, Kishalachti lekrache hayam matzasi ger echad shenasa ishes achiv mi'imo. So ben Yasin said, when I went overseas, I found that there was a ger, a convert, who married his brother's wife, his maternal brother's wife. Amarti lo b'ni mi hirshacha. So I said to my son, tell me, who allowed you to do this? Amar li, hari isha v'shiva banea. Right? So he said to me, but I'll tell you, there was this woman with 7 sons. And what? V'shiva asaf salzeh. So I'll say, look at Rashi this moment. Hare isha, ki yores v'shiva banah, sheheter lahen Rabbi Akiva, lisa ish es eshes achev umehena lamarati. So the man essentially said to Ben Yasin, Rabbi Akiva allowed a woman with 7 sons to marry her brother-in-law. To marry her brother-in-law. It was the case of a giyarus, to marry her brother-in-law. So we'll say, so essentially what the man was saying is, I relied on halachic precedent. Okay? What's halachic precedent? Listen to this. Asaf Salzeh Yashav Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva himself, this is what the guy is saying, sat on this bench. Va'amar shnei divarim. Rabbi Akiva said 2 things. Can you imagine, by the way, being able to point to a bench? Rabbi Akiva sat on the, what wouldn't you give for a bench that Rabbi Akiva sat on in Paskin Halacha? Right? Rabbi Akiva sat on this bench and he said 2 things. Rabbi Akiva said many more than 2 things, but 2 things that he said on this bench. Number 1, Ger no se eshes achav mi'imo. Number 1, Rabbi Akiva paskined that halacha lamaisa, a ger is permitted to marry the wife of his maternal brother. That's number 1. Va'amar, and a piece of Agarata, Rabbi Akiva said, Vahi devar Hashem al Yona shenis lemar. I will say the Navi Yonah, the story of Yonah. So the Navi says that Hashem said to Yonah again, Shenis, go back to Nineveh. Shabbos say the Gemara Darshans over here, Shenis Dibra Imo Shchina, Shlishis Lo Dibra Imo Shchina. Shabbos say, here's what's interesting, that the Shchina never spoke to Yonah again after the story in Nineveh. That as much as we know the story of Yonah, right? Yonah heard the Dvar Hashem to go to Nineveh, tell the people in another 40 days Nineveh is going to be overturned, and Yonah ran. He decided not to go ahead and fulfill his shlichus. And I will say, why did Yonah run? Why did Yonah run? So the Gemara says, Yonah was concerned with the covet of Klal Yisrael. Yonah was concerned, why? Because Yonah knew that if he would go to Nineveh and tell them that the city is going to be destroyed in 40 days, what were they going to do? They would do tshuva. And that would reflect terribly on Klal Yisrael. That would effectively be a theological indictment of Klal Yisrael. Yonah decided better to incur the wrath of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and be kovish nevu also, refuse to transmit prophecy, which is a major transgression. Better to do that and take one for the team and not theologically indict Klal Yisrael. That was Yonah's cheshbon. That's why he ran. Even though what he did for Klal Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu was still upset with him. And therefore the pasuk says, Hashem spoke to Yonah a second time. The Gemara infers from this a second time, but never a third time. This was the last time that Hashem spoke to Yonah. Shenis Dibra Imo Shchina, Shlishis Lo Dibra Imo Shchina. Katani Mihas, Rabbi, before we get to that, Katani Mihas, Ger no se Eshes Achav Mi Imo. Rabbi, what did Rabbi Akiva paskin? Rabbi Akiva paskin explicitly that a Ger is permitted to marry the spouse of his maternal brother. Explicit. And we're not concerned about confusion in other cases. To which the Gemara says, well, what's the case? My lav naspa echav kishehu ger. It must be the case of where two brothers converted, and they got married once they already converted, once they were Jewish. To which the Gemara says, lo, no, what's the case? Where the brothers got married, right, when what? They were non-Jews. Got married when they were non-Jews. Maila memra. I will say, a marriage that occurs when a person is not Jewish is not halachically valid. There's no halachic legitimacy to that. So Lamaisa again, so what Rabbi Akiva is saying, that if a brother got married when he was not Jewish and then converted and never consummated the relationship after they converted, and now let's say he divorces his wife, that the remaining brother can marry her, that's obvious. In that case, I will say that's even easier. There's no halachic marriage at all over there. Ma'od detema. Nigzer kishu ovid kochavim ato kishu ger. You might have thought that maybe we should go ahead and legislate in a case where he was a guy, lest you come to go ahead and confuse it with the case where he got married once he was a ger. Kamash malon, no. Kamash malon, we'll say. So therefore, again, we have no raya. So when this guy said, Rabbi Akiva permitted a ger to marry his maternal brother's sister, that was talking about a case of a marriage that was affected when they were goyim. So there's no raya to our case, right? I will say our case is where you have maternal, right? You have converts who are maternal brothers who get married after they convert. Now the shaila is, could one brother marry the other brother's spouse? That's what we're focused on. So no raya from Rabbi Akiva. So the Gemara brings up another interesting side point. To me, mehemin, what I don't understand is someone believed in this type of situation. What does that mean? Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rafuna, Amar Rav, Kol Talmud Chacham Shemora Halacha Uba. Im kodem ma'isa, am rashomim lo, ve'im lav ein shom. Both say, remember again, we had this concept before. Remember, both say how this whole story is happening over here. Ben Yasin goes overseas. He finds this guy who married his maternal brother's wife. So Rabbi Yasin said, who allowed you to do this? So he said, Rabbi Akiva paskin this way. I will say, in general, when someone comes up with a brand new psak halacha that we never heard before, and the brand new psak halacha just happens to justify something that they're doing, as one could imagine, it raises a halachic eyebrow or four, right? In other words, he'll say that in general we don't accept halacha like this. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, "Ibai seima mora ubahaya." So we'll say one possibility is the halacha lamaisa, right? Mora uba. So vibai seima mishum de kamar hari isha v'sheva banah. So we'll say, so one idea is that halacha lamaisa, he was bringing a precedent, right? And remember again, he pointed to another case. He said, remember, there was this woman and her 7 sons. So he was quoting precedent. I will say precedent is a big thing, right, in legal circles. He's quoting precedent. I'm not the first person to rely on this. Rabbi Kivari Paskin, there's the woman. Here's her address. Go talk to her. Number 2, V'bai Seima Mishum de Ka'amar. I'm sorry. V'yibaysema shani hacha dekamar ma'isa achrina bahada. I will say this is also different because remember he was simultaneously quoting two piskei halacha of Rabbi Akiva, one ultimately in halacha and one of Agarata. So the fact that he's quoting other things in this psak halacha also lends some additional level of legitimacy. So we'll say let's focus on Yonah for just a moment. Amar Mar, Vahid Dvar Shema Yonah Shenis Leimar. So we'll say the pasuk says Hashem spoke to Yonah a second time saying, Shenis Dibra Imo Shchina. Shlishes lo dibra imo. The Shechina spoke to Yonah a second time, but not a third time. So the Gemara says, "I v'haksiv." Is that true? So who heishiv eskavul Yisroel milavo chamas ad yoma arava kidvar Hashem asher diber biad avdo Yonah ben Amitai Hanavi. Shabbosai pasuk seems to indicate that Hashem did speak with Yonah another time. To which the Gemara says, "Amar Ravina al iske ninve ka'amar." Ultimately, again, when it says that Hashem never spoke to Yonah another time, that meant about what? Nineveh. This was the last conversation that Hashem had with Nineveh, about Yonah, which is actually interesting. You know, Sefer Yonah ends in a very tragic fashion, right? Ultimately, again, where Yonah is incredibly despondent. Ultimately, again, he carries out the mission. And sure enough, as he was fearful of, the people of Nineveh engage in dramatic tshuva. I will say, which is why we read Sefer Yonah by Mincha on Yom Kippur. I will say, most people don't know that we read Sefer Yonah by Mincha on Yom Kippur, right? And again, some people think it's still part of the break, right? But I will say, but again, you know, it actually is amazing. Like, it's one of the most dramatic stories, and it is that time of Yom Kippur, where, like, you know, you get your second wind, you know, by Ne'ilah, but Mincha Yom Kippur, that's mamish, where a lot of times we're dragging. But the story is a dramatic one. And at the end of Sefer Yonah, Yonah is despondent and depressed because he has been successful in his mission to go ahead and cause Nineveh to go out and do tshuva, but it is the indictment. It was the nail in the coffin of Klal Yisroel at that point. Because I will say again, we for years, the same Navi Yonah was telling us to do tshuva, and we would not listen. And Nineveh instantaneously does tshuva. So what it means is Hashem never spoke to Yonah again in the Nineveh story, but he did speak to him again later on regarding other issues. So the Gemara says, "Aliski Nineveh kamar." So nachreis kamar amra hachi kamar kidvar Hashem asher diber biad avdu anavi kishem shenepach Nineveh meira'a letova kach b'yimei Yeravam ben Yoash nepach lem Yisrael meira'a letova. But I will say again, Yonah, the same way that ultimately, again, Yonah was successful in being able to go ahead and turn Nineveh meira'a letova. In the days of Yeravam ben Yoash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was also able to go ahead and help Klal Yisrael turn it meira'a letova. Okay, beautiful. A lot more to say on that, but we'll go weiter. Tashma. Ger shahaya leidasa b'kedusha v'harasa shelo b'kedusha. So we'll say if you have a ger, ultimately, again, who was born to a Jewish mother, but ultimately was conceived by a Gentile mother, which means his mother converted when? During her pregnancy. So what's the halacha? Yesh lo she'er min ha'em, ve'en lo she'er min ha'av. He has maternal relatives, but has no paternal relatives. Kate said, what's the case? Nosa achoso min ha'em yotzi. If he marries a maternal relative, so we'll say if he marries his maternal sister, he's not allowed to remain married to her. Yotzi. Min ha'av yikayim. If he marries his paternal sister, he's permitted to remain married to her. Because we'll say, so remember again, just to frame the case here, right? So mother conceives, okay, with her Gentile husband. Okay, now what happens during pregnancy? She converts. Son is born, right? Ultimately, again, to a Jewish mother. So we'll say, so what the Bryce is establishing is his maternal relatives, halachically, are looked at as relatives. His paternal relatives are not. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, if he goes there and marries a maternal sister, he is obligated to divorce her. Marries a paternal sister, yikayim, technically is permitted to remain with her. Achos ha'av, min ha'em yikayim. Achos ha'av min ha'em. So we'll say, what happens if he marries his father's maternal sister? Right? He marries his father's maternal sister, Yotzi. He has to divorce her. Then I both say, why? We just said there's no relationship from the father because it's his father's maternal sister. Whenever there's an element of maternal relationship, even if it's on the father's side, we're going to go ahead and tell him to get out of that relationship because we're just concerned about confusion. In general, marrying your father's maternal sister is going to cause a lot of confusion, not just halachically, right? I'll say familially as well. So in any event, so we'll say, so we go and we tell him divorce. So Amud Beis, so the Gemara says, Mina av yikayim. If you marry your father's paternal sister, ultimately, again, you're permitted to go ahead and remain married to her. So the Gemara says, Achos ha'im mina'im. If you marry your mother's maternal sister, Yotzi, divorce her. Mina'av, if you go ahead and you marry your mother's paternal sister, ultimately, again, Rabbi Meir Omer Yotzi, v'cham mikayim. Rabbi Meir says, divorce her. Ultimately, Chacham say you could go ahead and remain married. Why? Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol erva shehi mishum she'er ha'em yotzi mishum ha'av yikayim. Because Rabbi Meir was of the opinion, any erva that has an element of maternity to it, right? Even if it's on the paternal side, ultimately, again, you should be yotzi. You should divorce. Ultimately, mina'av, you're permitted to go ahead and remain. Umutter be'ishes achiv. Nebosai, the Bach takes out me'imo. Umutter be'eshes achiv, you are permitted to go ahead and marry your brother's wife, ube'eshes achi aviv, and with your be'eshes achi aviv, with the wife of your father's brother, usha'ar kol ha'arayos mutaros, and any other erva is mutter as well. So the Gemara says, La suye eshes ha'av. Ultimately, again, to include what? Even father's wife. Yes. Just again, we'll say, just to be clear, because this is not like God, this is, right, just to be clear. Ger, that's how the whole brisa starts out over here. This is a ger. Now, the ger in this case, again, was shayisa leidasa bikdusha v'arasa shalo bikdusha. In this case, I will say, when he was conceived, his mother was not Jewish, born to a Jewish mother. So I will say, just to understand what's happening over here. When he's born to a Jewish mother, the only person in this world who he is truly converted to is who? His mother, right? Which is why, again, halacha lamaisa, right? He's permitted technically to all of these paternal relatives. There's no issue because halachically he's not related to them. The only time, and in the case on the paternal side, the only cases in which we're legislating, that's why when we say he's allowed to marry his father's wife, we'll say, why? Why? It's not his father's wife, right? That we're calling it his father's wife because Lamaisa, again, it's his father. In other words, it's his biological father. But halachically, there's no relationship. The only situation where he has real relations is what we call she'er min ha'em. His mother's, right, relations that he has through his, right, relatives that he has through his mother. And then we'll legislate, therefore, any relations that he has through his father are permitted, but any relations through his father that have a maternal aspect. What do you mean that have a maternal aspect, right? His father's maternal sister will say, don't marry her. Why? Because there's that maternal thing. Anytime where there's a maternal piece, not through his mother, but there's an element of maternity there, we're going to say, don't marry that woman because, again, we're nervous about confusion. Fine. We're not finished. Ube'eshes achi aviv, usha'ar kol arayos mutaros lo. And any other of these arayos are absolutely permitted to him. Permitted to him. So the Gemara says, La'asuye eshes ha'av. Ultimately to include even his father's wife. Nasa isha ubita. What happens if he married a woman and her daughter? So kones achos umotzi achos. Ultimately, and I will say, so interestingly enough, if he married a woman and his daughter, so this is just a Sairayas case. So ultimately, you could remain married to one, and you can't remain married to the other. So kones achos umotzi achos. But lechatchila lo yichnos. Lechatchila, ultimately, again, you should not marry. Now, I will say, who that's referring to, we'll see in just a moment. Meisa ishto muter bachamoso. But say if one's wife dies, he is permitted to marry his mother-in-law. V'ika detani, aser v'chamoso. Others say, you're not permitted to marry your mother-in-law. Katani mihas. Now we'll say, okay, so now this is a pretty wild brisa. Remember, we'll say, we still have a very narrow focus. What do we still not have resolution on? What are we still stuck on? We're still stuck, I will say, on one very simple case. Brothers who convert, are they permitted to marry each other's spouses? In other words, we'll say, again, Reuven and Shimon convert, and whether Reuven and Shimon themselves are converting, right? Or ultimately, again, their mother converted and gave birth to them. Right, so we'll say we're dealing with a very simple case, right? They have no paternity; they're not related from their father, right? So we'll say again. Let's say Reuven's married, gets divorced, is Shimon or dies. There's no Yevamos and Chalitza that I understand. Are they permitted to marry each other's spouses or not? That's what we are hyper focused on and been unable to get an answer to that. So we'll say we're zeroing in on this. So the Gemara says, Katani mihas. What did I just see in this brisa? Muter be'eshes achiv. That one is permitted to marry, right? In the case of the convert, right? Ultimately, again, I will say in this case where their mother converted while she was pregnant with them. Let's say, just give it a case of twins even. That one brother is permitted to marry his brother's spouse. My love dinas ba'achiv kishuger. Aren't we talking about cases where the brothers converted, right? And they got married once they were Jewish. And the Bryce is telling me that halacha lamaisa, they can marry each other's spouses. Lo dinas ba'kishu ovekochavim. No, so keep going back to this. What's the case? Where they got married ultimately again where they were non-Jews. If that's the case, my lememra. They both say then there's no marriage. Of course, one brother is permitted to go out and marry the other brother's spouse after they convert. You might have thought you should legislate the case where they got married when they were non-Jewish, lest you come to confuse it with the case where they got married when they were Jewish. So the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, no, we're not worried about that. Amar Mar, Nasi, Shabbos says, so still no resolution. Nasa Isha Ubita, so let's go back and hone on one of the other cases. Nasa Isha Ubita, Konis achos umotzi achos. If you're married to a woman and her daughter, Shabbos say that's aser. So you can be married to one and ultimately again divorce the other, or literally move the other from your home. So the Gemara says, umotzi lechatchila lo yichnos. But lechatchila you shouldn't do this. To which the Gemara says the wording doesn't make sense. Hashta afuke mafek. If you're telling me that you have to divorce one of them, obviously lechatchila mibai. Do you have to tell them lechatchila you're not allowed to marry them? Of course. To which the Gemara says, Hasam Kai. It's not referring to that case, it's referring to a different case. V'achei kamar, hach dam rabbanan yikayim. So when the rabbanan say ultimately again, yikayim, that, let's say, look at Rashi. Hanach dam rabbanan yikayim ki gon achosa min ha'av v'chavrusel. So we'll say, so let's say, for example, the cases in the Braisa that said that technically speaking, it's mutter. For example, Rabbosai, a ger is permitted to marry his paternal sister. That's how, right? Technically, he's permitted to marry his paternal sister. The Brisa says such a marriage works. Even though such a marriage works, l'chatchila lo yichnos. The Brisa says, l'chatchila, don't do it. Don't do it. So the Gemara says, meise ishta musa brachamoso. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. This is an important qualifier. In all of the cases of the Mishnah, where the Mishnah said about, the Brisa, right? We'll say this wild Arayas Brisa, that essentially said you can't marry, the ger can't marry anyone to whom he is maternally related, but what? Can marry everyone who he is paternally related to, even though you can. What does the Brisa say? What does the Brisa say? L'chatchila, don't do it. If you did it, it works, but b'di'evet l'chatchila, don't do it. Okay, but we'll say, let's just look at the last part of the Brisa. So, meise ishto muter bechamoso. So, we'll say if a person's wife dies, he's permitted to marry his mother-in-law. V'iga detani aser bechamoso. But yet another version says he's not permitted to marry his mother-in-law. So, we'll say, so who's who? Chad de Rabbi Yishmael v'chad Rabbi Akiva. We'll say this is a machlokus. We actually just saw this. Man does like Rabbi Yishmael. So the opinion who says that it's aser, he holds like Rabbi Yishmael. The Amar chamoso la'achar misa b'isura kaima, because Rabbi Yishmael holds that halacha l'maisa, one's mother-in-law remains prohibited even after the death of one's spouse. B'isura kaima v'gabe ger gazu be'rabanan. And Abba say even in a ger, we legislated in that case as well. So the Gemara says, "V'gabe ger gazu be'rabanan man desharu Rabbi Akiva." And Abba say the opinion who holds that you can marry your mother-in-law after her death, after the wife's death, then that's like Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva held that a mother-in-law after the death of the spouse is a weaker love. Look at Rashi. Rashi says there are kalish leisura dilagabi Yisroel ina b'sreifa. That I will say Rabbi Akiva still holds that it's usher to marry your mother-in-law, but as opposed to during the lifetime of one's spouse, it's an isser sreifa. After the death of a spouse, it's not an isser sreifa. So by Yisroel, it's a weaker isser, and therefore gabi ger lo gaza b'rabbanan. Therefore, I will say in the case of a ger, ultimately again Rabbanan will not go to. So I will say if let's say a ger marries a giores, technically speaking, there is an isser d'Rabbanan for that ger to marry his wife and the mother-in-law. Right? Assuming the mother-in-law is not Jewish, right? Once ultimately again the wife dies, ultimately again there'll be an isser d'Rabbanan. Rabbi Akiva will hold that there's no isser upon the ger. Okay, so I say, beautiful. We finish the sugya. But yet it still feels like what? Not it feels like we don't have clarity about the one core case that we started the previous Mishnah with, which is, what do I do with maternal brothers? Right? So maternal brothers who convert, we will say, what is the nature of the prohibition? Or is there a prohibition for them to go ahead and marry each other's spouses? So I will say, let me share with you, the Rambam in Hilchos Isurei Bia, we have a few minutes now, Parak Yud Daled. So I will say, I'll give you the Maramakom. This is in Parak Yud Daled, Halachos Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, and Yud Gimel. Let me read it to you. Halach Yud Aleph. Akum Shenis Gayer. Right? So I will say, so principle number one, Akum Shenis Gayer, right? When a Jew converts, a Gentile converts, or for that matter, again, an Eved is emancipated. Hariyuki Katan Shenolad. They are like a child who's been reborn. Therefore, V'chol She'er Basar Shahari Lo Kishu Akum, O Kishu Eved, Einon She'er Basar. V'niskayer Hu Vehem, Eino Chayiv Al Achsen Shumer. So we'll say, the first thing we have to accept on a biblical level is Ger Sheniskayer Kekatan Shenoladami. When you convert, it is like you are reborn. And therefore we'll say, who are you related to when you convert? No one. Which I will say is an incredible thing. Because when a person converts, they go to the mikvah, they come out of the mikvah. In that moment, I will say, when the ger comes out of the mikvah, they are not related to any human being on the face of the planet. Which I will say is the most incredible thing, because there's one person or one entity that person has a connection to when they come out of the mikvah, and that is who? The Ribono Shel Olam. Right? There is only one, I go into the mikvah, I come out, there's only one thing in this world I am connected to, and that is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the first halacha. Yud Beis. Din therefore, din Torah, shemutar la'akum shisa imo, o chosam yishem miskairu. Therefore, I will say, technically speaking, midaraisa, the ger converts. Is he allowed to marry his mother? Is he allowed to marry his mother? Technically, yes. Can he marry his sister, his maternal sister? Yes. Aval, here we go. Chachamim asru davar zeh, shelo yomru banu mikidusha chamura lekidusha kala. Now I will say, here, our argument didn't explicitly say this, but this is an important principle. But Chazal came along and said, no. Can't marry your mother, can't marry your sister. Why? Because I will say, it's going to look like a person came from a strict moral code to a lax moral code. Because remember, Bnei Noach also have a moral code. And in that moral code, incest is prohibited. See, even though now we'll say, when the ger converts, is it incest? Is it incest? No, because he's not related, but it looks like incest. Right? So therefore, again, so Chazal came along and said, can't marry your mother, can't marry your sister. Fine. So we'll say, so again, principle in halacha yud aleph, ger sheniskayir kekatan shenolad, when you're born, you're not related to anyone, and therefore can marry anyone. Second halacha, Chazal's Rabbanan said, no, you can't. No, you can't. Anyone who is an erva to you when you're a guy, right? When you're a guy, ultimately midrabanan, you cannot marry once you convert. Now, watch this. Okay, so now here's what I know. I know that even though when I convert, I can marry anyone, the Rabbanan came along and said, no. There has to be legislation for this, because otherwise it looks like you're coming from a strict moral code to a lax moral code. So now what's the shaila? So therefore, who is included in this rabbinic ban? Watch this. Keitzad dinagerim ba'arayo shel sher basar im hayanasi kishu akum li'imo o la'achoso v'niskayer fine. V'mayanasa is sharayos v'niskayer hu v'ishto imar fishnosan. Okay, here's our point. Ger aser b'sher ha'im achar sheniskayer medivrei sofrim. They will say a ger is not permitted to marry anyone whom he is maternally related to after he converts. There it is. There it is. So whoever you are maternally related to, right? When you were a guy, right? When I was a guy, whoever I was maternally related to, those maternal relationships remain rabbinically prohibited even after conversion. That's the phrase. Mzger ase b'sher ha'im achar sheniskayer medivrei sofrim umuter b'sher ha'av. But I am permitted to anyone whom I am paternally related to, even though what? I know for sure my father is. Let's say I grew up on a desert island, right? It was only my mother and my father, right? So again, I know my father was. Nevertheless, again, that was today's daf. Halacha does not recognize the paternity of a Gentile. Even without any issues of immorality, we don't recognize that paternity. So Rabbi says, again, the Rambam paskins that midrabanan she'er mina'im, any maternal relations are prohibited even after you convert. Any paternal relations are permitted. He goes on, he says, lefichach. Therefore, Rabbi say, here we go, lefichach, no sehager, eishes achiv me aviv, ve'eshes achi aviv, ve'eshes aviv, ve'eshes beno, afa pish nises la'achiv, o la'aviv, v'chin achos ima me'avia. So we'll say, therefore, again, the Rambam gives all the examples. Aval, eino nose lo achosa me'imo, lo achos me'imo, ve'lo eshes achiv me'imo, shenasa achiv me'imo achar sheniskayer. Therefore, Abosai, I am not allowed to marry my brother's wife. My maternal brother's wife, assuming that what? My brother got married after he converted. Right? So I will say, so see what's happening. So therefore, again, let me just zero on this because we have another minute. But say, listen to this. So again, the Rambam paskins, let's just go through the case, right? So number one, Ger sheniskayer kechatan shnola dami. Who are you converted to after you? Who are you related to after you convert? No one. But midrabanan Chazal said, you can't marry she'er mina'im. You can't marry any maternal relatives. You can marry who? Any paternal relatives. And therefore, Abosai, halacha l'maisa, if you're right, you can't marry your maternal, and you can't marry any maternal brother. So therefore, again, Abosai, let's go back to our question. Can I marry, I'm a ger, can I marry my maternal brother's spouse? Can I marry her? It depends. What does it depend on? So let's say my brother also converted. Now we're both converts. When did my brother get married? If my brother got married when he was a guy, right, and never consummated that relationship when he converted, that's not a marriage. And therefore, everyone would agree that halacha l'maisa, I can marry his wife upon death or divorce of my brother. But halacha l'maisa, if my brother got married after he converted, then halacha l'maisa, there is a rabbinic prohibition upon me marrying my brother's wife upon his death or divorce. So I will say that's how he passed halacha l'maisa. So you are not permitted to marry your brother's wife upon his death or divorce, even though they're both converts, as long as that relationship took place after the brother converted, because that will be she'er min ha'im. So ger sheniskayer kekatan shenola dami, technically midaraisa can marry anyone. Chazal said you can't marry she'er min ha'im, and therefore halacha l'maisa, in this sugya we paskin like Rav Sheshes, and therefore again, two convert brothers, one brother cannot marry the widow or the divorcee of the other, even though of course there is no mitzvah of yibum in that situation. Why is there no mitzvah of yibum? Because mitzvah of yibum only applies to paternal brothers. Rabosai, shkoyach.